Private members' business, notice number 2.
Ms Lauder.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I move the motion standing in my name on the notice paper relating to community facility zone land.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Ms Lauder.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to speak to the motion I put forward in regard to community facility zoned land. I feel it's a very important issue in regard to what is permissible for the government to include on community facility zoned land, and it's the subject of a lot of current debate in our community. I think we could go back to looking at the reasons why we have zoning laws. And they're there to improve the public health, safety, convenience and welfare of our citizens. They help us to plan for the future development of communities, to develop new community centres with adequate utility, health, educational and recreational facilities, to recognise the need of industry and business for future growth, to provide residential areas with healthy surroundings for family life, and assure that the growth of the community is in accordance with the efficient and economical use of public funds. And the Planning Act explanatory statement from 2007 explains the importance of proper planning. And I'll quote, "The planning and development of the ACT provide the people of the ACT with an attractive, safe and efficient environment in which to live, work and have their recreation." So these are the underpinnings as to why we have zoning laws in the first place. They're an important way that the government can promote the health, safety and general welfare of the community, to protect and conserve the value of buildings and encourage the most appropriate use of the land. In practice, zoning is also used to prevent new development from interfering with existing users and or to preserve the character of a community. CF zones or community facility zones are an important part of communities. People want and expect to have some community facilities near to them, and the way that our suburbs are designed generally allows for that. We've often heard of the saying, "It takes a village to raise a child." And if we're looking for a place to raise a family, people want to make sure they have an area with community zones nearby for their children or even their pets to grow and flourish. For example, that's why I chose to raise my family in Tuggeranong, because there are many community facilities nearby. Schools, places of worship, recreation areas, parks and playgrounds. And it worries me that there's the potential that my grandchildren growing up will not have the same access to community facilities as my children have had. Underneath these zoning laws, community facility zones include things like, and I'll just pick a couple because there's quite a long list, places of worship, childcare centres, libraries, outdoor recreation facilities and green spaces. There are other types of zones, industrial zones, residential zones. And for example, under an industrial zone, you might be able to build something like, I'll just pick one or two, a car park, a defence installation, a freight transport facility, a hazardous waste facility, or light industry, a transport depot or a warehouse. And of course, any of these, I think we would agree, would be inappropriate to build on community facility zone land because they're for an industrial purpose. Similarly, these are some of the objections as to why people don't believe community facility zone land should be used for residential land. However you dress it up, building housing, public housing, supportive housing, social housing, community housing, affordable housing, no matter what you call it, it's still residential going onto community facility zone land. And in practice, what's happened here is a technical amendment which is allowed under Section 87 of the Act, where a variation or an error variation that would not adversely affect anyone's right if approved has as its only object the correction of a formal error in the plan, a variation to change the boundary, etc., etc. These are the things that technical amendments can be used for. And there's a lot of community concern that a technical amendment has been used to allow residential development onto community facility zone land. A variation is allowed to clarify the language in the territory plan if it does not change the substance of the plan. Now, Madam Assistant Speaker, everyone I've spoken to in relation to this technical amendment believes it does change the substance of the territory plan. We've spoken about the fact that back in 2005, an Assembly Planning and Environment Committee held an inquiry, and what they recognised that some community facility zone land was underutilised and had the capacity to provide greater benefit to the community rather than sit unused. At that time, after that Assembly inquiry, there was a change to the definition of community facility zone land to include supportive housing, and that was made so that housing for the aged and people with disability could be built on community facility zone land. Now, social housing and supportive housing have quite different definitions. And the technical amendment that took place in 2015, which was very quietly put through just before Christmas of that year, allowing the government to use CFZ zones for public housing, happened because the government knew from the Public Housing Renewal Task Force, and we've seen this through the FOI information that's been released, the government knew that the proposed buildings of public housing were not allowed under the current territory plan. So they put through this technical amendment so that they could use community facility zone land for public housing. The documents discovered under the FOI show, I believe, the government knew the changes were not just clarifying the language, but in fact changing the substance and the intent of the territory plan, which goes against Section 87, which is what is allowed to use a technical amendment for. The FOI showed that questions had been raised and the government made these changes in the quietest possible way to limit public knowledge and in fact limit the knowledge of members of the Assembly that this change was going through. It did not come before the Assembly. Under Section 88 of the Planning and Development Act 2007, this type of technical amendment is subject to limited public consultation, and in this case the public was notified through a newspaper notice. Now, yeah, I'm not sure who does read those newspaper notices in this day and age. So, I know from my previous time working in the housing sector about supportive housing, social housing, public housing, community housing, however you want to talk about it. And the government have some definitions of what that means as well. And the government say in their particular websites, etc., what is social housing? And I quote from an ACT government website. The ACT government definition: social housing incorporates public housing, community housing and affordable housing, offering low-cost housing for people on low and moderate incomes and for groups whose housing needs are not adequately met in other forms of housing. So social housing is what we think of as an umbrella term. It encompasses public, community and affordable housing. Supportive housing is a very small subset of that, for example, under community housing. The way that this technical amendment has put through the wording to include social housing underneath sort of the definition of supportive housing tries to imply that supportive housing is the umbrella term under which social housing may be found, which is absolutely incorrect, and it's not what's found in a range of ACT government and federal government legislation, acts, agreements and other documentation. So it was quite an underhanded way, I believe, that this particular change was put through, and it certainly does not meet with the intention of a technical amendment, because it does change the intent of the territory plan. So today my motion acknowledges that it's important that these issues and concerns about the use of community facility zone land are considered and resolved before any more CFZ land is used for public housing. And we're asking in this motion today for the government to cease development or construction of any new social or public housing on CFZ land except where specifically for aged or disability housing, which was originally allowed following the 2005 amendment. This is important because we need to clarify for the benefit of our entire community that their community zones are intended for community facilities. We are also calling on the government to list any instances where public or social housing has been built on CFZ land already, except where specifically for aged or disability housing, to give the community that information so they can truly understand the extent to which these issues already exist. We're asking the government to outline clearly whether the 2015 technical amendment has significantly changed the territory plan. There are legitimate concerns from the public that the amendment was not a minor amendment, and the government should explain how the amendment changes the territory plan. And of course, it would seem this morning that Ms Lakuta, if not the Greens altogether, agree because they put through their own bill to clarify the use of those technical amendments. So I'm sure Ms Lakuta and hopefully the Greens as a whole will have no problem in supporting that particular clause, if not the motion as a whole. We're asking the government to provide a definition of social housing and supportive housing to the Assembly and outline where in legislation these definitions appear. I've already picked several of them from various government websites and the legislation register, but there are a range of definitions that appear, and I think it should be quite clear to the community whether the government, in a legal sense, believes that supportive housing is an umbrella term that includes social housing or vice versa. I think it's only fair that the community is allowed to know what the government believes is the case. We're asking the government to explain to ACT residents why CFZ land is being used for residential purposes when community facility zoned land is quite clearly intended for things like places of worship, recreational facilities, childcare centres, libraries and green spaces, to name a few. It's not intended for industrial or residential uses. So quite clearly, many people want to understand why this land is being used rather than residential zone land. And the government has done a poor job of consulting with the community so far on this issue, and other speakers this morning, including Ms Lakuta and Mrs Jones, have already spoken to that point about the lack of consultation and the loss of community faith, if you like, in the process the government has undertaken. It's time that the government answers to the people of Canberra about this community facility zone land that's about to become housing. The motion calls on the government to explain to the Assembly and the wider community why residents are losing access to land that was intended to provide them with suburban community facilities. So the government haven't stated the rationale for that. They're trying to make this more about public housing than about the loss of community facility land. Whereas in reality, Madam Assistant Speaker, the loss of community facility land will impact just as much on new residents moving to the area, whether they're in public housing or not. They will no longer have access to that land that was zoned for community use. So it's not only existing residents who are disenfranchised in this regard, it's the new residents moving in who will not have access to the same facilities. We're asking the government to provide to the Assembly a list outlining all community facility zone land that's currently being considered for public housing developments in the future. The Freedom of Information request that I received copies of last week showed that there were a number of lines in the table that have been redacted or blacked out, and this implies that there are many other areas that are being considered for public housing throughout Canberra as well. And I think that members of the public would like to understand whether this is being considered in their suburb as well, so they can think about the ramifications of losing access to what they believed was going to be a community facility, such as a childcare centre, a place of worship, a library, a green space or an indoor recreational facility, and that will no longer be the case. We're asking the government to report back to the Assembly on these matters by the first sitting day in June 2017.
The member's time is expired.